I've always thought my life could have been different if things had started on a better note. My name is Alex, and I'm 34 now. I don't remember much about my mom, just the warmth of her hugs and the scent of her favorite perfume. She died in a car accident when I was 5. My dad, John, wasn't the type to grieve openly. Within months, he remarried. Melissa came into our lives with a smile that didn't quite reach her eyes when she looked at me. From the beginning, I was an inconvenience, a reminder of a family she didn't want to deal with. It didn't take long before they sent me off to an orphanage under the guise of giving me structure and discipline. I'd like to say I was heartbroken, but even as a kid, I knew I wasn't wanted. Life in the orphanage was rough, but it taught me resilience. By the time I turned 15, I was working odd jobs to save for my future. I didn't have the luxury of dreams then, only survival. Yet, I managed to put myself through college, graduating with honors while juggling multiple jobs. Now, after nearly 2 decades of grinding, I've built a life I'm proud of. I've got a stable career, a solid savings account, and, just a few months ago, I bought my first house. It's not a mansion, but it's mine. Every corner of it screams freedom and independence, things I've clawed my way to achieve. And then, out of nowhere, John calls me. For years, we've been practically strangers. He'd send the occasional holiday text, a shallow attempt at maintaining some facade of fatherhood. But now, his tone was oddly warm, almost congratulatory. He'd heard about the house. The news must have traveled through relatives because I certainly didn't tell him. Out of politeness, I invited him and his family over for a housewarming party. It felt like the right thing to do, though my gut told me I'd regret it. When the day came, I wasn't prepared for the whirlwind they brought into my home. John walked in like he owned the place, his eyes scanning every detail with a critical gaze. Melissa, as always, had her sharp tongue ready. She commented on how the decor was surprisingly decent for a bachelor. Then there was Ashley, my half-sister, who I'd met a handful of times. At 22, she was the epitome of entitlement, treating my home like her personal Instagram backdrop. Her laughter was exaggerated, her remarks pointed. I could tell she didn't see me as family, just an anomaly to her perfect little world. The evening was exhausting. Melissa's barbs didn't stop, Ashley managed to spill red wine on my beige carpet without an apology, and John's simmering discontent was palpable. He barely concealed his irritation when guests, my friends and coworkers, praised me for what I'd achieved. It was as though my success was an affront to him, a mirror reflecting everything he'd failed to do for me. By the time they left, I was relieved. I thought that would be the end of it. But late that night, John called. His voice was firm, almost commanding, as he told me we needed to talk about a family matter. He didn't elaborate, and I didn't push for details. I assumed it was something minor, maybe a guilt-laden attempt to reconnect. But something about his tone left me unsettled. I didn't realize it then, but that phone call was the beginning of a storm I never saw coming. We met at a coffee shop, neutral ground, but the tension was thick from the start. He didn't waste time on pleasantries. His words hit like a sledgehammer, should transfer the ownership of my house to Ashley. Apparently, she was pregnant, abandoned by the father, and had nowhere to go. John framed it as my duty, an obligation as her older brother, to ensure she and her future child had a secure place to live. He even threw in phrases like family values and supporting each other. I sat there stunned. Was this some kind of twisted joke? This was the same man who had practically erased me from his life after remarrying, the same man who sent me off to fend for myself while Ashley grew up pampered and spoiled. Now he was demanding that I hand over the very thing I had worked my entire life for. I'd spent years scraping by, sacrificing every comfort to achieve what I had. I didn't owe them anything. When I finally found my voice, I refused. I said I'd help Ashley in other ways, financial support, maybe even letting her stay temporarily in one of the rooms, but giving her the house was out of the question. John's face darkened. He accused me of being selfish, ungrateful, and heartless. Melissa, who had clearly been eavesdropping on the entire conversation, suddenly appeared, as if she had been waiting for the perfect moment to intervene. Her timing was too calculated to be a coincidence. She piled on, calling me a disgrace to the family and claiming I had forgotten where I came from. It was surreal, listening to these people who'd shown me nothing but neglect, now trying to guilt me into giving up everything. The argument escalated quickly. I left the coffee shop before I said something I'd regret, thinking that would be the end of it. I was wrong. A few days later, I came home to find strangers hauling my furniture out of the house. My stomach dropped. I demanded to know what was happening, and one of the movers nonchalantly told me they were instructed by the owner, John, to clear the house for new occupants. My blood boiled. This wasn't just an invasion of my space, it was a blatant attempt to strong-arm me into submission. I immediately called the police. While waiting for them to arrive, I noticed something chilling. The spare key I kept hidden by the front door was gone. It didn't take long to connect the dots. They must have taken it during the housewarming party, planning this from the start. When the police arrived, I explained the situation and provided proof of ownership. Thankfully, they stopped the movers and escorted everyone off the property. But the damage was done. My trust was shattered, and my anger reached new heights. Furious, I grabbed my phone and dialed John to confront him about their actions. Before I could say anything, Melissa answered instead. Her tone was sharp and accusatory, as if she had been waiting for this call. She launched into a tirade, calling me selfish and heartless, and warning me that they would find another way to force me out of the house. Her words were venomous, each one designed to provoke. I interrupted her, my anger boiling over, and told her in no uncertain terms that if they dared to pull another stunt like this, I would take them to court. The threat seemed to catch her off guard for a moment, but she quickly regained her composure, hurling one last insult before hanging up on me. I sat there, seething, determined not to let them intimidate me further. This was my home, my life, and I wasn't about to let them destroy it. I knew there was more to this than met the eye. The sheer audacity of their actions didn't add up. Why were they so desperate to get Ashley into my house? And why now? Something about their urgency felt calculated, as if there was a bigger motive lurking beneath the surface. I resolved to dig deeper, to uncover the truth they were so determined to keep hidden. This wasn't just about the house anymore, it was about understanding why my family, who had discarded me so easily, was now hell-bent on taking away what I had built. The answers, I suspected, would change everything. Ashley's call came the day after I resolved to dig deeper. She wanted to meet, saying there was something important I needed to know. Her tone was hesitant, almost apologetic, which was a far cry from the entitled persona I had seen during the housewarming party. I agreed, hoping for answers, but I prepared myself for yet another confrontation. When we sat down, Ashley seemed nervous. She began with an apology, though it felt half-hearted, and then dropped a bombshell. She admitted her pregnancy wasn't some tragic love story gone wrong but the result of choices she had made over the years. Her words were carefully chosen, but the message was clear: she had been involved in activities that Melissa had encouraged, activities that bordered on exploitation. Ashley's life, as it turned out, was far from the picture-perfect image Melissa had tried to project. She confessed to being a model on platforms like OnlyFans, where she earned money by leveraging her appearance. That, however, was just the beginning. She also revealed that Melissa had pushed her into escort work, rationalizing it as a means to survive and maintain a comfortable lifestyle. Over time, Ashley had developed relationships with multiple men, any of whom could be the father of her child. She didn't know for sure and didn't seem eager to find out. I was floored. I hadn't expected this level of candor or the twisted role Melissa had played in Ashley's life. It was becoming clearer why they were so desperate to get Ashley into my house. Melissa likely saw it as a way to shield Ashley from the consequences of her choices while also ensuring a safety net for her daughter and future grandchild. But why involve me? I couldn't shake the feeling that there was more to this than Ashley was letting on. As the conversation continued, Ashley's demeanor shifted. She went from remorseful to defensive, almost as if she felt I was judging her. She tried to justify her actions, blaming Melissa for grooming her into this mindset from a young age. According to Ashley, Melissa had always drilled into her the idea that looks were her greatest asset and that traditional paths, like education or hard work, were for fools. Melissa's philosophy was simple: use what you've got to get ahead, no matter the cost. I left that meeting with more questions than answers. Ashley had painted a grim picture of manipulation and misguided priorities, but it still didn't explain the full extent of Melissa's motives. What was her endgame? And why was John complicit in all this? I couldn't understand how a father could stand by while his wife orchestrated such a toxic environment for his child. Driven by a need for clarity, I decided to take matters into my own hands. If Melissa had gone to such lengths to control Ashley's life, it was possible she was still pulling the strings. I started by discreetly observing her. Melissa had always been meticulous, but people like her often slipped up when they felt untouchable. Melissa had a routine, and routines are easy to exploit. Her so-called yoga classes had always seemed suspicious to me, and now I had a reason to dig deeper. For weeks, I had watched her slip out of the house in her designer activewear, carrying an expensive mat she probably never used. This time, I followed her. Instead of heading to a yoga studio, she drove to an upscale hotel downtown. My suspicions were confirmed when I saw her meet a man in the lobby. Their body language wasn't platonic, far from it. They embraced briefly before heading into an elevator together. I recorded the entire interaction from a distance. The evidence wasn't just damning, it was irrefutable. I confronted John later that evening. He was sitting in his usual chair, scrolling through his phone as if nothing in the world could disturb him. When I showed him the video, his face turned a shade of red I'd never seen before. For a moment, he was speechless, just staring at the screen. Then, the yelling started. His rage was directed at everyone: Melissa, Ashley, even me, for spying on his wife. But his anger quickly turned inward as the truth began to sink in. He had been played, manipulated into defending a woman who had no loyalty to him. As the confrontation unfolded, Ashley walked into the room. She took one look at John's face and knew something was wrong. When he demanded answers about her past, she hesitated but eventually came clean. She admitted everything: the modeling, the escort work, and Melissa's role in pushing her into that life. John's expression shifted from anger to something resembling heartbreak. He muttered something about being blind to the reality of his own family. The house felt like a war zone that night. Ashley broke down, admitting she felt trapped between her mistakes and the expectations Melissa had drilled into her. She said she regretted many of her choices but couldn't undo the past. At the same time, she blamed John and Melissa for never providing her with the support she needed to take a different path. Her words were like knives, cutting through the illusion of control that had kept this family together. Melissa, of course, tried to deflect. She accused me of stirring up trouble and claimed the video was a misunderstanding. But John wasn't buying it. For once, he saw her for what she really was. The shouting match between them was brutal, filled with accusations and revelations that only added fuel to the fire. By the end of it, John's decision was clear. He told Melissa to leave, saying he couldn't continue living a lie. He was done. The fallout was immediate and chaotic. Ashley was devastated, torn between loyalty to her mother and the bitter reality of what Melissa had done to her life. John looked like a broken man, struggling to process the betrayal from both his wife and the daughter he had failed to protect. And me? I stood in the middle of it all, realizing that my attempt to defend my own boundaries had unraveled a web of deceit far more intricate than I'd anticipated. By the end of the night, Melissa packed her things under John's watchful eye while I remained in the house, observing the fallout. Her attempts to argue were met with silence, her manipulations finally exhausted. John's parting words to her were cold and final. He said she could take her schemes elsewhere because he wasn't interested in playing her games anymore. The house, once filled with tension and fake smiles, felt heavier as she walked out the door. But the damage had been done. This family, if it could still be called that, was hanging by a thread, and I wasn't sure if it could ever be repaired. The morning after everything unfolded, I was at home, sitting at my kitchen table with a cup of coffee. The events of the previous night kept replaying in my mind, each moment demanding to be processed. The confrontation had drained me, and I was trying to make sense of how it had all spiraled so quickly and what it meant for the future. Around mid-morning, John arrived unexpectedly. I heard the sound of his car in the driveway, followed by a hesitant knock on the door. When I opened it, he looked older than I remembered, as if the weight of the previous night had aged him overnight. He asked if we could talk, and I stepped aside to let him in. In the kitchen, he hesitated before speaking, his voice unusually soft. He started with an apology, something I never thought I'd hear from him. He admitted he had been blind, choosing to believe Melissa's words over his own instincts. He confessed that she had been the one pushing him to demand the house from me, framing it as the only way to save the family. He looked me in the eye and admitted he had failed me as a father, prioritizing Melissa and Ashley while ignoring my struggles. His words felt genuine, but they couldn't undo the years of neglect. John's remorse, though late, felt like a small crack in the wall that had always separated us. He acknowledged that his choices had driven us apart and that his loyalty to Melissa had cost him everything. For the first time, he seemed willing to change, or at least to take responsibility. It was a start, but I wasn't ready to fully forgive. Not yet. Ashley, on the other hand, was facing her own reckoning. She came to me later that day, looking more vulnerable than I'd ever seen her. She said she wanted to make a change, to leave behind the life Melissa had pushed her into. She was determined to find a job, any job, and to build a future for herself and her child. She admitted she didn't know how to start but asked for my help. I agreed to support her financially for a while, just enough to help her get on her feet. But I made it clear that I wouldn't tolerate manipulation or excuses anymore. She seemed to understand, nodding quietly before walking away. Over the next few weeks, Ashley followed through on her promise. She applied for jobs relentlessly, eventually landing a position at a local boutique. It wasn't glamorous, but it was a step in the right direction. She also cut ties with Melissa, a decision that visibly weighed on her but one she knew was necessary. Slowly, she began to rebuild her life, focusing on her pregnancy and preparing for the future. It was the first time I saw her take responsibility for her actions, and I couldn't help but feel a flicker of hope. As for John, he threw himself into repairing what little was left of our family. He started by selling the house he had shared with Melissa, moving into a modest apartment nearby. He spent his days trying to mend his relationship with Ashley, though their conversations were often strained. He also made an effort with me, offering to help with anything I needed. I let him in gradually, unsure if his change was permanent but willing to give him the benefit of the doubt. Meanwhile, I focused on my own life. For the first time in years, I felt free from the toxic influence of my family. I threw myself into my work, taking on new projects and challenges that reignited my passion. I also started reconnecting with old friends, rebuilding the social life I had sacrificed for years. My house, once a battleground, became a sanctuary. It was no longer a symbol of conflict but a place where I could finally breathe. The final moment of clarity came one evening as I stood on the porch, looking out at the quiet street. The chaos of the past few months had finally settled, leaving behind a strange sense of peace. I realized then that sometimes, the best way to help someone is to set boundaries, to say no when it matters most. My family had tested me in ways I never imagined, but in the end, I had stood my ground. And for that, I felt stronger than ever. Family, I realized, isn't just about blood. It's about respect, understanding, and the willingness to let go when relationships become toxic.